Sometimes being set apart feels like being torn apart. But our job is not to change the circumstances of life, but to honor God in the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Amen. To honor God in the circumstances we find ourselves in. What a great sentence to say out loud. What a hard thing to do in life. It's so hard. Today, if you have a Bible, and I pray that you do, whether you open up your phone, turn on your iPad, take out your leather-bound copy, your Bible markers, your notes, or just reach under the seat back in front of you and grab one that we have for you today. Open it to Genesis. If you haven't been with us till this week, we've been in a series called Set Apart, where we see that Joseph, really under the storyline of Jacob, was set apart for God's glory despite some pretty trying circumstances. This morning, we're kind of finishing out that series. We're taking Genesis chapter 47, and we're covering 4 chapters. So we're going to take I would call a rapid pace, a rapid fire approach to these last 4 chapters. And as we've traveled through Genesis, some of the stories have been convicting for me. Some of them have been freeing for me. All of them have been good. If you've missed any of them, please go online and watch them. You know, I hear that it's good for a good nap or something. No, I'm just joking. If you've missed the one and you want to learn what God has taught us there, go back and watch them. We're going to be putting them in like a DVD set the next couple weeks. So if you want to give it, we're just going to give it to you, and you give it away to yourself or a friend or a family member. But today in these last 4 chapters, we're going to look at one theme. What we have been doing in like through 2 chapters or 1 chapters, you may have noticed, is that sometimes I have like 5 or 6 points, and you're just rapidly trying to keep up on your phone or a piece of paper just to keep all the points down. And that's been necessary. Today, as I approach these 4 chapters, I'm like, or maybe we'll have 12 points. And you're thinking, oh no, I'm not ready for 12 points. Well, don't worry. We're going to have 1 point. And we're going to see that 1 point, and we're going to follow it through every chapter. Multiple occurrences in a couple chapters, but we're just going to follow it through these 4 chapters. And that point is that what man means for evil, God means for good. And it actually comes from a verse that Joseph speaks to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50. He says, what you meant for evil, God actually used that for good. And I think that's a wonderful subject to discuss. We've seen God's people from the beginning of the book of Genesis, which we're kind of putting a book in, not only in the Jacob story and the Joseph story, but do you realize as we close out Genesis 50, it's putting a book in and bringing closure to the whole book of Genesis? I mean, it seems like a long time ago when we started in Joseph's life. A lot of things happened in these 3 or 4 decades that we've covered in his life. But do you remember where the book of Genesis begins? The beginning. That's what the book of Genesis means. Literally, it's a Greek interpretation of a Hebrew word, Breshit, which means the beginning. The book of Genesis starts with the beginning of time. And from that first chapter, it's been a great book about God's people being set apart, that even though the world intends evil, even us as his creation who are set apart for him, even though we intend evil through this life, God takes that, and through his sovereignty and his providence, and he uses it for his good. Sometimes despite our sin, and other times, even when we're not in sin and evil is coming just from the world, he plans out that he will use that for his good and his glory. And I want to promise you this before we get started too deep. If you would let this reality sink in, this 1 point, of being able to see whatever's going on in the world that's evil, which by the way, we live in an evil world. Some of us forget that, but there's evil all around us. It's encroaching at the doorsteps of your homes and at the doors of our churches. If you could realize that evil, whether it's caused by you or the world, that God uses that for his glory and his good, it's going to bring you freedom. Because some of you right now are going through a situation that just feels terrible. You would call it evil. Maybe it's something that someone's doing to you. And you say, this is just evil. It's destroying me. Knowing what God does here through the life of Joseph in terrible circumstances, whether he's in the pit or prison, that God has a plan for that. And he could have a plan for your struggle or your terrible situation. It's going to free you. Because see, the greatest blessing I believe in Joseph's life is not only that God used the evil of the world, the evil of his brothers for good, but that Joseph could see it. That's a huge blessing. In the times when he didn't hear a word from God, a word from Pharaoh, a word from anyone or anywhere, 2 years in prison, pleading, thinking that someone's going to remember him. 2 years, no answer, no answer. I believe the only way that Joseph got through that is because he knew that yes, the situation was evil, yes, the situation was terrible, but that God was going to use it for his glory and his good. And therefore, it was Joseph's joy to not just get through it, but to thrive in it. There's something probably going on in your life right now that feels like an evil, whether you've caused it or someone else is causing it. God can get you through that. In fact, he's with you while you're going through it right now. If you can see that, it's going to prevent two things. One, from you falling into pride if it happens to turn around and go good. God transforms that horrible situation into an elevated situation. When you're on the mountaintop, you're seeing victory. The promotion has come. Life is sweet. Everything's changing. If you see that God's hand's in it, you'll give him glory and you won't fall into pride and say, look what I did. Or if it doesn't get any better, because some of you have been in a situation and you say it's not just a moment of evil in my life, it's a season of evil. Some of you would say today, this is a life of evil and terrible circumstances that I live. And I can't promise you that it's going to get better tomorrow. I can't tell you it's all going to be okay in 2 or 3 weeks. Even if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, I can't promise you that. But I can promise you this, and it's going to help you. That God can use it for his good. And maybe even God wants to use it for his good. That's the story of Joseph. Chapter after chapter, circumstance after circumstance, God continues to use these situations for his glory and his good, and Joseph had joy because he could see it. So as these people are set apart, as we lead up to Joseph, just think about him for a second. Think about Adam and Eve in the garden, set apart for God's glory, living in perfection, not a care in the world. I mean, they didn't even know they were naked. That would be a wonderful feeling. I mean, if that happened to you today, you would know it. I would know it, and I'd probably ask someone to have you leave or something. It'd be terrible. But they were just living in this blissful circumstance in the land that God called them to. Well, then it realizes that 2 other themes are going to come out of their lives that we're going to continue to drive in Genesis. Not only the land that they lived in, but the seed that they would produce and the covenant that they would have with the Father. Both of those last 2 things, which we see as major themes in Genesis, land, seed, and covenant. These last 2 things, we see the land that God called them to in the Garden of Eden, but the seed and the covenant came after the sin. Despite the evil in the world, and Adam and Eve, as they took the fruit and ate it and fell into sin, God had the seed and the covenant come out of that. And from the beginning, Adam and Eve were set apart so that they could hear from God as he was speaking to the serpent. Yes, she fell into sin, but as he spoke to the serpent, you remember these words of the promised seed? He will strike your heel. You may deliver a death blow to him, but this promised one, he will rise up and crush your head. There it is, the seed. And then through them, and then we go on, and then we see covenants made with Noah. And then like in Genesis 12, we see land, seed, and covenant in the life of Abraham. Though he came from a pagan world, there was evil all around the world. God called him to a land. He continued the promised seed through his son Isaac and on into Jacob and his 12 sons, and on we'll go. And he made a covenant with Abraham that would be fulfilled partly in Abraham's life, but it would only see its full fulfillment in the seed that would come. And I'll go ahead and tell you his name. His name is Jesus. All of it came to fruition. Very early on, setting people apart. Land, seed, covenant. We continue to see this in Abraham, and then we see it in Isaac as he passes on the seed, and then in Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, and we see the seed already to this point in Genesis 47 has been passed on and through Judah. Oh, what a beautiful picture we see of Judah again today. And then the covenant's reestablished despite the slavery in Egypt, and God's will continues to be accomplished for his good despite the evil of the world. Today, as we catch up in Genesis 47, and this one point of God using evil for his good, we're just going to see it. So let's get started. In Genesis 47, Joseph now is at the point where he's already had reconciliation with his brothers. Well, let's call it a reunion. A reconciliation process is still continuing. But he's already showed them forgiveness. They've been reunited. And then he has the reunion with his father, Jacob, and it's a beautiful scene. And now in Genesis 47, Joseph is, in the sweet spot, if you will. He's already shown forgiveness. He's had the reunion. His brothers are there. Now with he and his brothers and his father Jacob in the land of Goshen, he travels to Pharaoh and he tries to establish a lineage in Egypt for his father Jacob. And he takes 5 brothers with him. And he presents his brothers to Pharaoh. And he asks Pharaoh to let his family live in the land of Goshen. And if you remember in Genesis chapter 46, Joseph told his brothers what to say when Pharaoh asked them, "What occupation do you have?" And so they go before Pharaoh, and guess what question he asked here in Genesis 47? He asked the brothers, the 5 brothers that Joseph selected, "What's your occupation?" He basically tells them to respond in honesty. And they tell him, "We and our father, we are shepherds." Look at the verses here in Genesis 47:3. It says, "Your servants are shepherds," as the brothers speak to Pharaoh. "Both we and our fathers." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to travel or sojourn in the land. For there is no pasture for your servants, flocks. For the famine is severe in the land." Right there in Canaan, it's just getting worse. "Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen." Do you see the humility in their hearts? The familiar theme that you've seen already in the last couple of chapters, you see it here again. God changing the heart. And then you'll see another familiar theme later in Genesis 50 of God showing forgiveness and then Joseph showing forgiveness. But here in this common theme of God changing the hearts, I just want to stop for a second and acknowledge the change that had happened in the hearts of Joseph's brothers. They're in a terribly pressured situation, speaking to the known leader of the world. Then I want you to think about, okay, how do the brothers usually respond in a pressured situation? That's not even this much pressure. Do you remember when their father showed favoritism to Joseph and then he went out innocently trying to greet them and bring them some supplies? In Genesis 37, that pressured situation of them hating their brother Joseph, how do they respond to that? With manipulation and violence, trying to turn the situation against Joseph. And they get Joseph and they beat him up. They throw him into a pit. They were going to kill him. And Judah, who is now the hero, back then says, "Let's sell him into slavery." And they continue to manipulate the situation instead of like here where they come free and tell the truth. When they go back to talking to their father Jacob, they say, we gotta fix this. Joseph's already gone. Should we tell Dad the truth and say, "Hey, we did this terrible thing to Joseph. Please forgive us"? No, we don't even see that enters their mind. What they do is they slaughter a lamb. They dip the coat of 7, or not the many colors. I don't know how many colors it was. The coat of many colors. They dip it in blood and they bring it back to Joseph. They said, "Dad, an animal killed Jacob. Dad, the animal killed Joseph." Again, manipulation and lies. Then think back to later in Genesis when Joseph is trying to see if he's ready to approach this reunion with his brothers with joy, or should he approach with caution? He puts some test on them. And think about how they respond in the pressured situation of the test. When Joseph looks for someone to step up and to go back home alone, no one steps up. When Joseph asks for one of them to stay there with him and the rest of them go back home to get their brother Benjamin, no one steps up. Instead, when the pressure comes on, they start infighting. Reuben starts pointing fingers as the elder instead of being a leader, and they start turning on each other and they start manipulating the situation. But here, suddenly, in the most pressured situation they've probably been in, as they stand before Pharaoh, he could have them killed at any moment. He's the most powerful man on the world at this time. Knowing because of their lunch with their brother, who they didn't know he was their brother at the time, from the lunch that they had with Joseph, that they had to sit separately from Joseph. Do you remember what the Bible told us? Why they had to sit separately? Because the Egyptians despised, hated shepherds. They thought shepherds were disgusting and wanted to have nothing to do with them. They could never eat with them. It was probably disgusting to even have these shepherds in their house as they had lunch with Joseph. Now as they appear before Pharaoh in this pressured situation, they say, "We are shepherds." Knowing that Pharaoh and the whole land of Egypt despises these shepherds. I think that shows the change of heart that is occurring inside of them. I want to take this shepherd theme and work it out a little bit because I think it's the first example in our text of God taking something that is despised and what the world considers ugly or even a situation of evil, and he turns it into something beautiful. This theme of shepherds, which Egypt hated, they hated shepherds, God uses this theme throughout scriptures and he makes it into something that's fantastic and beautiful, and I just want to show you that for a second. Do you know after Jacob and his 12 sons were shepherds and they lived in the land of Goshen, do you know who came after them to deliver them from Egypt? We call it the Exodus. What was that man's name? Maybe the most famous Hebrew ever to live? Moses. And when Moses left Egypt and he went off into the wilderness in the Midian, what was his job title? What did he do? He was a shepherd. And through the despised, disgusting position of shepherd, God delivered the whole nation of Israel from the land of Egypt. And through that despised staff that was a representative of a disgusting shepherd, God used that staff for Moses to put it in the Red Sea, and he parted the Red Sea, and his children walked across on dry land. He made something despised, and he turned it into something beautiful. And after Moses was the shepherd, we see the theme continue. Probably the second most popular Hebrew ever to live, the most popular Israelite ever to live, that came after Moses, maybe even more popular in the eyes of many Jews today. Who was that man? King David. Do you remember what David was? What was his occupation before he was king? David was a shepherd. And while David was a shepherd, he penned some of the most well-known and loved verses ever spoken about God in Psalm 23. Do you know what God's referred to as by King David, who was a shepherd? Remember Psalm 23, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, my provider." He says that because I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still or quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, David says. The worst situations you can ever imagine. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, and my cup overflows because you're providing for me, my shepherd. He says, surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord, my shepherd, forever. The shepherd theme starts off disgusting here in Genesis 47 through 50, but God makes it into something beautiful, even ascribing himself this position of shepherd. But it goes on past David. The prophets refer to the shepherd a lot. And then probably the greatest association with shepherd is in the life of Jesus. Do you remember who announced Jesus, the King of the universe, coming onto this earth? Who were those men? The first annunciation. After the angel, the first humans were shepherds. Jesus himself refers to himself in John as the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. See, what Jesus is not only is he the shepherd, our guide, our provider, our rock, our everything that we need, he's also the lamb that would be sacrificed for our sins. This shepherd theme continues in the life of Jesus. Finally, the New Testament calls what these leaders are that stand before their churches and are responsible for equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry. My favorite term associated with that leader is shepherd. In fact, the Greek word for shepherd is poimon. It's where we get the word pastor. So if you ask me, Todd, what do we call you? I mean, you can call me Todd, but I guess ask this question, especially from some of our older congregation. What do you want to be called? If I am forced to respond, the response is shepherd. Because that's what the Bible refers to me as. But I'm not the shepherd. I'm just the under shepherd. I follow Jesus, the shepherd, and my responsibility is much like that, to guide you as he guides me. This shepherd theme comes to light as Jesus lays down his life as our shepherd for us, his sheep. And then this theme of God taking something despised and make it into something good or beautiful, it goes on. I mean, that's what God is in the business of. So if you're weak here today, he's in the business of making you strong. If you're here today and you're in an ugly situation or ugly circumstances, you know what he's in the business of? Making that into something beautiful. And because our King, the shepherd, was also the lamb, it leads us probably to the greatest symbol that I want to talk to you about of our shepherd that's given in all of scriptures, that is an example of taking something despised and rejected and ugly and make it into something beautiful. You know what that symbol is? It's the cross. Who would want to die on a cross? That's what our shepherd did. He died and was the lamb that was slaughtered so that we, his sheep, though we were ugly and despised, could be made into something beautiful. He took that symbol, that the Romans used to humiliate you in your nakedness after you were beaten and you were jeered and you were made fun of, and they nailed your hands and they nailed your feet to a cross where you would suffocate and die. That is a despised symbol. Even the Old Testament says, "Cursed is the man who dies on a tree." That terrible, ugly symbol of a cross that would have never been in an office, hanging on a wall, or worn around a neck 2,000 years ago has become the most beautiful symbol of redemption and forgiveness that has ever existed on this earth. God is in the business of taking something that is evil, ugly, and despised, like a shepherd, and creating it into something beautiful. I know I had to just take a second with the shepherds. We got a lot out of shepherds, but we must move on in Genesis 47. As you turn your attention here back to Genesis 47, you start to see the theme change from Joseph back over to Jacob again. Here, Jacob interacts with Pharaoh. He has 12 sons of his own, and he wants to provide for them. And the Bible shows us that Jacob actually meets with Pharaoh as if they're equals. Can you imagine that scene? Jacob, the tribal leader of about 70 in his family, who, yes, God would make into a great nation, but now he's nothing more than a shepherd over 70 other shepherds. He stands as an equal before Pharaoh, who is the leader of the known world. And they speak as equals, like two tribal leaders speaking together. Then after that moment, you see something really amazing here. You see the despised shepherds of Israel, about 70 people, who were once on the bottom and lowly. You start to see some contrast. Here, Egypt, in chapter 47, starts to fall, and their blessing starts to go away, and this great exchange happens where now Jacob and his family and Israel, tiny group of 70 shepherds, they start to come out on top. In Genesis 47, you first see this theme of contrast happen when Egypt continues in the famine. It says they were starving, so guess what they would do? They would be hungry, they'd want to go buy grain, and it affected their pocketbooks, number one. And when they went to go buy grain, who did they go to? They go to Joseph. All the Egyptians from all of the land, when they wanted grain because they were starving, as the famine got more severe, they went to Joseph and they said, "Here, take all our money. For better you have money than us to die of starvation." But it doesn't end with their pocketbooks. We start to see the shift a little bit more as they come to Joseph again. This time, they don't have any more money, so they say, "We will give you all of our livestock, our cattle, and everything that we have to survive on. We would rather you have all of our livestock than for us to starve and our families to die." So now he has all their money, gives it to Pharaoh. He has all their livestock, he gives it to Pharaoh. Joseph and his family are finding favor again. Not only does it affect their pocketbooks and their livestock, but then they come to him, they don't have anything left, but they said, "You know what? We have land. And it no longer will be our land. We will give you our land if you'll just give us some grain so we won't die." So now Joseph takes all their land and he gives it to Pharaoh. Favor again. And finally, they have nothing left. They have no money. They have no livestock. They have no land. You know what they have left? Their freedom. And the people of Egypt exchange their freedom and they become slaves, and they give that to Joseph, which Joseph gives it to Pharaoh. And now the whole land of Egypt is without anything, not even their own freedom, except for Joseph, Jacob, and his brothers. What a great contrast. What a great favor of the Lord, of God taking something that is lowly and making this something great and beautiful. And as we transition out of this time of Genesis 47 to 48, we see another great interaction. This time it's not between Jacob and Pharaoh, it's between Jacob and his son Joseph. Here in Genesis 47 and the 48, as we're driving towards 49 and 50, quickly, we see Jacob getting old. He's about 147 years old at this point. He's dying. I mean, that's pretty old, right? I mean, none of you are probably going to live that long. But he's at his last stage of life. And he calls to himself all of his sons, and he starts with Joseph. And Joseph, who's called to go see his dying father, he brings his two sons, whose names are Ephraim and Manasseh. What's interesting here is the conversation that occurs between Joseph and his father Jacob. The first thing Jacob does is he says, "Joseph, come here." Now get this is going to freak you out a little bit. He says, "Put your hand under my thigh and make a promise." I mean, he could barely sit up in bed. "Put your hand under my thigh and make the promise to me that when I die, you will take me back to Canaan, so I will not be buried in the land of Egypt." He says, "Put your hand under my thigh and make that promise to me." That's what Joseph does. He makes a swear, and you're thinking, what is going on with the hand and the thigh? That's weird. Listen, culturally, we're different. Things in other cultures are weird. If you go to West Africa, it's going to be weird, as you have to sit on your left hand because you can't use it. If you use your left hand, it's disgusting. They use their left hand for other things. So that's weird for me. Well, guess what? It's part of the culture. It may be weird as you go to Indonesia. It's going to be weird when you travel across the world. But cultures are different. And in this culture, Abraham did the same thing when he was talking to his servant who was going to pick out a wife for his son Isaac. It was a personal request. He wanted to ensure that this servant was going to do what he wanted to personally. So he brings him to him personally, and Abraham tells the servant, put your hand under my thigh and promise me you will not let my son Isaac marry some foreigner. And here, Jacob does the same thing. Make a personal promise to me, one-on-one, mano a mano, that you will not let me be buried in Egypt. And so Joseph doesn't allow that to happen. And then he goes on and he starts to want to give blessing to Joseph. And he starts with saying, your two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now get this, this is big. You may not think it's big, but it is big. He says, Manasseh and Ephraim, your two sons that you had in this pagan land, they're a part of the nation of Israel. You're like, of course they are. I mean, they're Joseph's children. But do you realize that they're not only Joseph's children, they're also the children of a pagan woman. And it's a big deal that Jacob automatically says that they are now a part of the nation of Israel. What a great blessing. I think it has to do with how dedicated Joseph was to his children. While he was in Egypt, he named his sons. While he was in Egypt, before he even knew that he was ever going to see Jacob again, when Joseph probably never thought he would ever see his brothers again, when Joseph did not know if he would ever not be Egyptian again, he could have gave them a lot of different names, but he chose two of the most Hebrew names that would have sounded totally crazy to the Egyptians. He chose Ephraim and Manasseh. That impresses me with Joseph. That in midst of the land of what he calls his affliction, and all the prosperity and all the good things that he got from Egypt, when he thought about Hebrews and his dad and his brothers, all he could probably remember was evil. Being sold into slavery, the pit, all the terrible things. And all that he can remember with Egypt is maybe a little prison, but then he got promoted and everything's going well now. And he names them Ephraim and Manasseh. And I think Jacob is acknowledging that fact and says they are a part of Israel. My question is, just for a second, would you have that same dedication as Joseph? To live in a land of prosperity and promise, where you're being promoted so high? Would you have the courage of Joseph to maintain you raising your children for the glory of God and be as dedicated to it as Joseph was? You're sitting there thinking, yeah, I would. Yes, if I lived in the land of Egypt in prosperity, I would be focused on raising my children in the glory of God. Or would you be a little distracted by being satisfied that your children were in prosperity and they were going to have a good education and they were going to grow up and likely have great jobs and live in happiness in the land? Would that distract you at all? You say, no, I would maintain raising my kids for the glory of God. And I say, would you? Do you not live in the land of Egypt? You're thinking, no, I don't. Oh, no. Do you live in the land of blessing? Which is actually the land of oppression, what the Bible would call it? Do you not get distracted with your children? Do I not get distracted in raising my children for the glory of God and get a little distracted that I live in this land of prosperity? Do I not get a little distracted by being satisfied that my kids are going to go to a good school and I'm going to stay focused on that and they're going to get a good job and they're going to grow up successful and happy? Does that not distract me a little bit from raising my kids in the glory of God? I've got to admit to you today, I do get a little distracted. And I wonder if you do as well. I encourage you, like Joseph, maintain that dedication to raising your children and your family for the glory of God. Because if we were doing it with just Southern Baptist churches alone, 44,000 Southern Baptist churches, we say all across this country, with millions and millions of believers and families, if we were dedicated to raising our children like Joseph was in the midst of the land of prosperity, not getting distracted, would our country still be taking such a downward plunge into immorality? Or would we be standing up, not getting distracted, and living our lives doing something about it? Because you do know that the downfall of our nation right now, you can blame it on the government, you can blame it on all kinds of other people, but the main cause of the downfall in our country comes through the downfall of the family. That's a fact. I ask us to have the courage. You may not have to name your children Manasseh and Ephraim, but to maintain raising them in your family for the glory of God. And then Jacob here, he blesses Joseph's children, but don't miss how he does it. He takes his hands and crosses them so that his right arm is sitting on Manasseh's head. His right arm is sitting on Ephraim's head, who's actually the youngest, and his left arm is sitting on Manasseh's head. And that was symbolizing that he was passing the blessing on to the youngest son when the blessing should have been passed on to the oldest son. Now, we learned some things there. Number one, that God's plan of redemption is for everyone. You see that in the first reality that they're actually pagan children, not just Joseph's children, but they're children of a pagan woman. And the fact that God would still allow them to be brought into the people of Israel and the promise to come through that family still shows that God's plan of redemption is for everyone. Not only do we see here that ethnic diversity is allowed in God's plan of redemption, but God desires it. We also see that in Genesis 38. Judah there, who the promised seed would actually come through. You remember what happens in Genesis 38? He sleeps with his daughter-in-law named Tamar, and through that, who she was a pagan woman, through that, the seed of the Messiah would come through. God's plan of redemption is for everyone. Don't miss that in your stereotypes or your racist look at the people around the world or anything like that. Not only that, but God's plan is not only for the Jew we see here, but also for the Gentile, for all of us here today. I'd be willing to bet that none of you are Jew by birth. All of you are Gentiles, and God shows his heart very early on in the story. We also see that God's plan of redemption here, by how Jacob is blessing Joseph's sons, is God's plan. Because the cultural thing to do is for the blessing to go to the firstborn son, then the secondborn son. But the blessing going to the secondborn son is actually a common theme in this family history. Think about Abraham. Abraham had two sons. Give me the name of Abraham's first son. Ishmael. He was the firstborn, but who did the promise go through? Isaac, the secondborn. And then Isaac, he had two sons. What was Isaac's firstborn son? What was his name? Esau. Did the promise go to Esau or did it go to the secondborn son, Jacob? Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons. The oldest one was Reuben. Is that where the promise went through? No, you'll see in the text today that the promise skipped over Reuben, it skipped over Simeon, and it skipped over Levi and went to Judah. Judah was where the promise seed came from. Speaking of Judah, look at these verses here that the Bible tells us about this plan that God had for Judah. Genesis 49:9 says that Judah is a lion's cub or a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, it says, you have gone up, or you've escaped the prey. He crouches, he lies down as a lion. And as a lion, who dares to awaken him, or who dares to rouse him up? This, of course, points to God's greater plan of Jesus being the Lion of Judah that has all the power and who feared no enemy. For if you turn to Revelation 5:5, we get a picture from this revelation that John had from God. John records that one of the elders in Revelation 5:5 said to me, "Stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome so as to open the book with its 7 seals." No one could open the book with the 7 seals other than the root of David and the Lion of Judah. It also says in 49:10 that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Jesus, the Lion of Judah, who had the power to open the 7 seals, would be the ruler of all time for all eternity. Not only is it mentioned in Revelation, but it's mentioned right here in Genesis 49:10. God's plan of redemption is God's plan. It had nothing to do with human achievement or even birth order. Then you take Joseph, the obedient son. He was given the primary blessing as if he was the oldest son. All this does not make sense in the realm of men, but it's a wonderful example that despite it not making sense in the realm of men, it works out for God's good, which is his glory, and that should be our joy. Jacob finishes blessing his 12 sons, and he takes his last breath. And of course, we see here Joseph, as he transitioned from Genesis 49 to 50, of course, he weeps like any son would. And then he has his father embalmed, and for 70 days, the nation of Egypt mourns over Jacob's death. Then Joseph gets permission to take his father's body and keeping the promise that he made. Remember, with the hand under the thigh? He keeps his promise, and he takes the body of his father Jacob back to the land of Canaan. He puts him there, and then he comes back, and we see another familiar theme. Forgiveness again. Look at Genesis chapter 50. This time when Joseph comes back, he comes to find his brothers with an emotion that they're familiar with. That emotion is fear. They're afraid in Genesis chapter 50 that now that their father is dead and now that their father is gone, they're afraid that Joseph is now going to take this opportunity to get revenge on them, to show them the wrath that they deserved. And so they come here in Genesis 50 to Joseph. Look at verse 17 of Genesis 50. They say, please forgive us the transgression of the servants of God and of your father. What was Joseph's response to that? It says, Joseph wept. Genesis 50:18, they fell on their face before him and they said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them in Genesis 50:19, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? Joseph here responds with forgiveness. He'd already shown his brother's forgiveness earlier when he says, I am Joseph and I will provide for you and I will provide for my family. Why does Joseph weep here if he's already shown them forgiveness? I believe Joseph is weeping here. He's so brokenhearted that they don't understand the forgiveness or they receiving the forgiveness that he has already freely given them. That God has forgiven him, God has forgiven us, and he is living that forgiveness by showing them forgiveness, and he's brokenhearted that they have not yet received it. He wants them to understand and accept his forgiveness. He gave it to them before they even pleaded for it, but once they pleaded for it, he tries to convince them again. He says, am I God? No, I'm not your judge. Look at Genesis 50:20, and here I'll end on this verse because, we're just flat out of time. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph says these words that I mentioned in the beginning that I believe kind of sum up everything that's been going on in the whole story of Joseph, Genesis 37 through 50. Look at what he says. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. What he's saying here in this whole story, and especially in these last 4 chapters, is that what man means for evil, God uses for his glory. What a great attitude to have in this world. If you could learn to understand that despite what evil is going on in the world, that God can and probably intends in your life to use it for good, you would have more peace, you would have more hope, you would have more freedom, and you wouldn't be so willing to give up when life gets tough. Please understand this today. If you were a follower of Jesus Christ, if you understand that the Good Shepherd gave his life for you, his sheep, and you were following him, please understand that life is about us glorifying God and not about him glorifying us. That's the message of Joseph. Despite the good or the bad, Joseph saw that life is about glorifying God and not about God glorifying him. The Bible is clear. All of you here today were created for one purpose, and that's to reveal the glory of God. We get confused sometimes. Even as we say about the cross, which is this beautiful symbol of something destructive and terrible, and God turned it into something beautiful. Why do we say that Jesus died on the cross? We say Jesus died for my sins, which is true. But that's only half truth. See, that just centers on what Jesus did for you. Jesus died on the cross for the glory of God. If you would realize that and not just make it about you, because see, if you just say Jesus died for me, then it becomes about your joy and about your happiness and about your health and your wealth and your prosperity and all that God can do for you. Next thing you know, you're making Christianity about a religion where God worships you and you don't worship him. But if you add the glory of God to the mix, it'll keep you focused. That you live your life for the glory of God, whether it's evil or good. And when it's good, it'll keep you from being prideful. And when it's bad, it'll keep you from being destroyed. That's what Joseph understood, and it allowed him to finish strong and leave us a wonderful example of a man of integrity and character. The same can be for you today, whether you're on the mountaintop and need to be prevented from falling into pride, or whether you're in the valley and you need to be prevented from being destroyed by the situation. The same is true. God can use it for his good, which is his glory. It can also be for your joy.